All right, so last week we talked about stress and we got into the brain a little bit and talked about some of the stuff going on there and the pathways that can activate stress response and activate certain hormones that are in the body, including the cortisol and the epinephrine, or also called adrenaline. All right, so this week we want to get a little bit deeper into the brain, talk about neurons a little bit more, and then connect this all to exercise. So exercise is going to be our big topic for the week. Okay, and maybe segue into the next big part of the NES combination that we learned about at the very beginning of class, right? Nutrition, exercise, stress, sleep, and social connections. So we've been focused on stress quite a lot and ways that we can de-stress. We're going to learn a little bit more now about exercise, and we're going to start by learning about how exercise and stress are connected together. So first, I'd like to take a few minutes to introduce you to neurons, which are the primary cell type that is going to be transferring information around within your body from your brain to your body and back again. So visually, neurons are very strange looking cells. They have a lot of projections that are coming off of them. So they'll have a center of the cell or cell body, and they'll usually have one large projection coming out of them that's called the axon. And then they'll have multiple smaller ones that are coming into the neuron that are called the dendrites. And the dendrites, or the smaller components, are usually used to receive signals. And then these larger pathways, usually one or two, are used to actually send information that they're receiving down to the next neuron or maybe a muscle group inside the body so that you have a response. Okay, so there's three fundamental types of neurons. The first are the sensory or afferent neurons. These guys can have their cell bodies most often in the peripheral nervous system. So there's the peripheral nervous system and the central nervous system. The central nervous system, abbreviated CNS, which is shown down here, contains the spinal cord and the brain. And this is the central component that contains most of the neurons inside the body and most of the cell bodies for those neurons. The sensory neurons, however, are a little bit different. Their cell bodies mostly lie inside the peripheral nervous system, which is everywhere else in the body other than the brain and the spinal cord. And their projections then are going to stretch from wherever they're at inside the body all the way into the central nervous system, where they can relay their message that they're receiving as their signals. So like the name implies, the sensory or afferent neurons are going to detect changes inside the body. So they detect senses inside the body, from hormone releases to the amount of glucose present, any changes that are going on. They're going to sense those changes. They can also sense other external environmental cues such as heat, coldness, wind, pressure, all kinds, touch, all kinds of different things from the environment. And so this information then gets transferred into the central nervous system, which is the brain or the spinal cord. The second type of neurons are called the interneurons. These are completely located in the central nervous system, so they're only in the brain and the spinal cord. And they will lie in between the sensory pathways and the motor pathways. So about 90% of our neurons are interneurons, or most of the neurons inside our bodies. They typically are going to be used to process, store, and retrieve information and be able to run our systems and help us interpret the sensory information and activate the correct downstream pathways in the motor neurons so that we get an effect from that or response from that. So the motor or the efferent neurons are the ones that are going to send signals out from the central nervous system to place other places inside the body. These can include the muscles and the gland cells. They can also include other cell types that are found in organs that are going to carry out other responses or effectors. So in addition to hearing the term motor neurons, you may hear them referred to as the efferent neurons because they play roles in more than just movement, right? And so it's really any response from the body. So typically the cell body for these neurons is found in the central nervous system, and then the projections are going to be sent out from the central nervous system to the effector cell. So these guys can be super, super long, right? The motor neurons that are found like at the base of the spinal cord have to extend all the way down your leg to your big toe so that you can move your big toe and walk across the room, right? So these can be very, very long cells. So this shows a very simplistic type of pathway between these systems, right? So you first have this sensory neuron, and you can see this box over here is representative of the peripheral nervous system, or the PNS. And then this box here is representing the central nervous system, the CNS, and that is inclusive of the brain and the spinal cord, the peripheral nervous system, everywhere else. So muscle tissue, organs, anything else inside the body. So you can see for the sensory neurons, the cell body is often out in the peripheral nervous system. And you've got the dendrites and things that are collecting signals, and then the axon is going to extend back into the central nervous system where it's going to interact with one or more interneurons. So the interneuron pathway may not be direct. This is a very simple circuit with just one interneuron in between the sensory and the motor neuron. But you could have very intricate pathways that can have multiple interneurons that are going to different motor pathways. And so these can be very complicated pathways. So this just is representing a very simplified circuit for you to visualize. So you've got the signal moving through the interneuron that's completely inside the brain or spinal cord. And then it's going to activate one of its downstream targets. Shown here is the motor neuron. So that cell body is inside the central nervous system. It could also be a dendrite that's like fanning out here. That's not really shown in this slide, but that's all right. And then it sends its signal down the axon, and it's going to deliver that to the downstream targets, whether that might be the muscle tissue if you need to move. Okay, so that's a simple circuit setup that uses all of these fundamental types of neurons inside the brain. So when we're thinking about the connections between the different neurons, the neurons actually are not touching each other physically. So you can see here there's like this little gap space in between the sensory neuron and the interneuron that it's going to be activating. And so this is shown in greater detail on this slide. If this was our sensory neuron coming in here to activate the interneuron, which is downstream, you can see that there is actually a spatial gap. They're not actually physically touching each other. So to be able to send a signal from one place to another, it has to rely on small molecules or chemicals. And these small molecules are called neurotransmitters. So these neurotransmitters are going to be released from the upstream neuron. In this case, it's our sensory neuron. And when it gets activated, you've placed your hand on a hot stove, for example, and that heat is causing the sensory neurons to go off like, oh my gosh, heat is coming into this hand and you're going to burn yourself very soon. So it's dumping out this chemical signal, going to the interneuron that's going to send a quick message to your motor system to move your hand off of that hot stove. Right? That happens through these chemical messengers They get released and get recognized on our postsynaptic neuron, the interneuron, that are going to then activate that pathway. So that downstream target has to have proteins embedded in the membrane that are going to recognize these chemical signals and become activated. So these proteins that are down here are called receptors. They're going to receive the message from that upstream cell. And this space in between the neurons is called the synaptic cleft. Okay, so we've had a brief introduction to the brain. We've had a brief introduction now to neural circuits and how messages are delivered to and from the brain so that we can have a response. That's all very simplified, and that's going to be fine for our conversations, just to help us understand a little bit more about what's going on inside the brain and how exercise is actually affecting this type of stuff. So I want to introduce you to a molecule that's called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, or BDNF. And so that's a big name, big mouthful, but hold on with me and we will see what this molecule is doing inside the brain. So John Ratey likes to term this compound miracle grow for the brain, and so we're going to see why. So BDNF is a protein that gets secreted from the cells. So it's made inside a cell and then it's going to be exported outside the cell so that it can interact with the other cells that are next to it. And in fact, this BDNF is made by a lot of brain cells that are sitting next to those neurons. So the brain is not only a place where neurons are going to be located, but there's also other supporting cells that help support and feed the neurons within the brain. And so the cells that support the neurons, one of the compounds that they can express and release is called BDNF, this brain-derived neurotrophic factor or growth factor. So when the BDNF is present and interacting with the neurons that are located in that specific area, they encourage the neurons to have growth and differentiation of the neuron. And BDNF is expressed most widely in areas of the brain that are important for things like learning, memory, and higher thinking. So it's interesting to take a look at this compound and see when is it present, what types of things do we do in our lives that will cause the expression of this so that we can increase or enhance our ability to learn, to remember things, and to do higher order thinking. So BDNF belongs to this class of compounds that are called neurotrophins. And that's a big word, but neuro just is referring to the brain, right? And trophins refers to growth factors. So neurotrophins, like BDNF, are going to cause the growth or enhancement of the neurons that they are expressing the BDNF into. So here you see a neuron. So this might be our sensory neuron. It's sending signals down to activate the inner neuron that's downstream from it. So it's going to release its chemical substrates in there. And then you can see that there's another cell over here that's called an astrocyte. This is one of those supporting cells that's inside the brain that will help feed and protect the neurons that are next to it inside the brain. So astrocytes will perform very important functions inside the brain, and they will also receive signals from the neurons. So every time you activate a neuronal pathway, the astrocytes are getting information about that as well as the downstream target neurons. And that's important because they secrete these neurotrophic factors like BDNF. So if you're activating, say you're studying to remember a pathway, or maybe you are rehearsing for a concert and you're practicing a piece on the piano, or you're working in a sport where you're practicing over and over again certain plays or movements that you want to be able to repeat and do kind of automatically. So all of these features are going to activate the neural pathways that are going to help you achieve that downstream goal, right? Whether it's learning a mathematics equation or how to play a piano piece. And every time you activate that pathway, this astrocyte over here also gets activated. So the more that you activate this pathway, the more the astrocyte gets activated. And the astrocyte is actually going to express or release these neurotrophins, right? And so if BDNF is released into the synapse, it is actually going to cause the synapses to grow, right? So it's going to cause the axon to grow bigger, and it's going to cause the downstream neuron that is receiving the signal to grow a bigger dendrite, right? So the connection between the neurons in this pathway gets stronger over time the more often that you use it, right? So this is why John Ratey calls BDNF the miracle grow for the brain, because when you have it present, and this gets secreted more when you have more activation of that pathway, right? Your brain is saying, hey, this is getting activated an awfully lot, so this must be an important pathway to this person. So we're going to grow that pathway and make it stronger. So the more you study, the more you're going to activate that pathway, and the more you will have better recall about that pathway. So repetition is important in learning. So BDNF is actually found in a range of tissues and cell types. It's not just in the brain. It also gets expressed in places like the retina, other places in the central nervous system, in motor neurons, in the kidneys, the prostate, and the saliva. So it has roles kind of all over the body. So let's take a look at some animal studies involving BDNF and see what we can learn about. So there is this study that we can use for seeing how rats learn that's called the Morris water maze. And so what you do is you put the rat inside this big pool, and rats don't really like to swim. They're not super fond of water. And so they also put a platform that's an invisible platform in there that's just below the surface of the water that the rat can go over and it can stand on, so it doesn't have to tread water and keep swimming, right? So the rat will want to come over to the platform and be able to sit on the platform. So, but it's got to find the platform. So in this system, there is a visual landmark. In this case, we have a big star that's over on the east wall that the rat can see when he's put inside the water. And so we're testing to see if they can use this as a landmark so that if they're placed in the water in different locations, will they be able to find the platform faster, right? So this is about spatial learning and memory performance. So if we have rats that are cognitively impaired and they don't really do well in this maze, and we can see that this happens in aged rats. They get old just like we do, and they will become cognitively impaired as they age oftentimes. And so when they put them into this water maze, they can swim around quite a lot trying to find the platform, and they don't learn very fast, right? So you can do this over and over, and you can see they're pretty slow learners. But if you take these cognitively impaired rats and you add an infusion of the BDNF protein into the brain, you can see that this will actually improve their ability to learn where that platform is, and they can get to the platform faster. So that's pretty cool. So we can see that BDNF is useful in helping learning and memory. So how does this relate to exercise? So interestingly, the when you exercise, it actually will induce the expression of these neural growth factors such as BDNF. So this has been shown to happen in the hippocampus, and the hippocampus is actually a very special site inside the brain that's really crucial for spatial learning and for memory. So when you exercise, BDNF is going to be increased within the brain, all throughout the brain, but the most dramatic increases occur within the hippocampus, where you've got learning and memory, very important, and in the posterior cortex. So this is where you have a lot of connection with the hippocampus for things like spatial learning and the interpretation of things that are going on within the body and the external environment. So in addition, we know that when we've examined the effects of exercise in human populations, it's a little bit more difficult to look at BDNF levels in humans. We can only detect it in the blood and can't directly tell where in the brain it's actually at, obviously, because you're using your brain during the experiments. Right. So, but we have found that exercise does have positive effects in slowing disease progression in things like Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's disease, and in Huntington's disease. So exercise has a positive effect when we think about these disease states. BDNF levels have also been associated as playing a role in disease states such as depression and schizophrenia, that there's reduced levels of BDNF in these different diseases, and that potentially increasing these levels can have an effect on decreasing things like depression and the symptomology of schizophrenia. There was a study conducted at Duke. The title is Exercise Treatment for Major Depression, and you can see the reference here if you want to take another look at this. But this study showed that there are long-term benefits of exercise for depression that are either equal or even better than treatment with drug compounds such as Zoloft. So this study grouped patients into 3 different groups. They had a group that only received the Zoloft treatment. They had a group that received Zoloft and they had exercise therapy. And they had a group that received exercise therapy alone. So the patients that were in this study were treated for 16 weeks total, right, in these 3 ways. And then the treatment ended, and then they followed the patients out for another 6 months. So you can see that after the 16 weeks or the 4 months that they were in the program, you can see that there were pretty equivalent rates of remission at the end of 4 months, with 60% in the exercise therapy alone and 69% with the treatment with Zoloft alone. The Zoloft plus the exercise was kind of in the middle there at 66. Not sure that that is statistically significantly different. One thing that you can see, however, in the 6-month follow-up after, you can see the percentage of patients who had a relapse with their depressive symptoms following these treatments. And you can see that 38% of the patients that were taking the Zoloft and then ended that treatment, that 38% of them had another episode of depression coming back into their lives by the 6-month follow-up. The people that received Zoloft plus the exercise therapy, 31% had another episode of depressive features in their lives. And so I'm not sure that that's significantly different from that 38% group up above. And then this one does look significantly different. Only 8% of the exercise therapy alone had a relapse within the 6 months following the treatment. And you can see that after 10 months, right, the percentage of patients that were still depressed, about half of them, a little more than half of them, in the Zoloft treatment category were depressed at the end of 10 months after the study, and only 30% of the patients that received the exercise treatment alone. So, what this shows is that exercise therapy really improved the depressive symptoms that were seen in this patient population. So, that's very cool to know that exercise therapy can have a prominent role in mood. So, that is one of our takeaways. So, exercise can elevate mood. So, what exactly is BDNF doing? So, BDNF, when it gets expressed and secreted into the cells and it's interacting with those other neurons wherever it's being expressed at, I said that it could help control the growth of the axon terminal or the dendrite of the downstream target pathway, making them bigger and more substantial. So you can see that that could effectively help learning and memory, right? And so when BDNF gets expressed, it is going to be expressed in places like the hippocampus, important for learning and memory. It's expressed in the amygdala. The amygdala is one of those centers that's involved in fight or flight response. The insular cortex and the prefrontal cortex, which help in decision making. So, BDNF is thought to play a role inside these cells by helping control the expression of genes. So, they don't alter the genes that are already there in the cell, but they may help enable the genes in the downstream target to become activated and cause the expression of those pathways to make new proteins that are going to help with cell growth and with learning and memory. So, when you have a factor that can cause differences in the expression of the genes, these are called epigenetic factors. Epigenetics is kind of on top of the genes, right? And so this is just affecting the expression of the genes without actually changing the genes or the genetic makeup of the cells that it's affecting. So, jumping back to our stress lectures, we saw that acute stress can induce the release of our glucocorticoids like cortisol, and at low doses, this actually supports neuronal branching and survival. So we said acute stress is the fight or flight response when the lion jumps out and you got to run away really quick. And then once that stress is gone, the hormones go down and you're fine again and you don't have the chronic stress. Remember, we said chronic stress is the one that leads to increase for disease states. But we did say that acute stress is important, right? Stress is on that kind of thing where a little bit of stress actually has more benefit, more health benefit than having no stress at all, right? And so no stress at all is less healthy. A little bit of stress that you can bounce back from, that acute stress, that's actually going to give you a healthier window. And then when you get into chronic stress that becomes unhealthy again, that gets into that red or danger zone. So these brief stresses will induce the release of our cortisol, and cortisol at low doses is going to support neuronal branching and survival. And so this positively influences performance in spatial learning and memory tasks, right? So there are some beneficial changes in the brain when you have small doses of stress in your life, right? And that kind of pushes you outside of your comfort zone into the learning zone, right? Where you feel a little bit uncomfortable, you're a little bit stressed. It pushes you to learn better. And one of the reasons is because of the cortisol. However, if you have too much stress, this leads to chronic stress and it leads to much higher levels of cortisol and these other stress hormones. And this will actually lead to a decreased secretion of BDNF or these neural growth factors. So this diagram has a lot of detail on it. The important things to take away from here is that you have a decrease in the BDNF that's shown here, and you can see this is reflected in the downstream target cell. You have fewer receptors, fewer neurotransmitters, and you can see the overall size of the downstream target and the upstream neuron becomes smaller, right? So if you have increased stress and chronic stress, this actually causes the actual neurons inside the brain to shrink, right? So you get a shrinking inside the brain, and learning and memory under these conditions becomes much more difficult. And you can actually visibly see this, right? So chronic stress also leads to depression. So these things are going to become linked, right? So you've got decreased BDNF, and you can see that this leads to atrophy within a stressed system. So here you have the control, normal levels of stress, not chronic levels of stress. However, when you have chronic levels of stress and heightened glucocorticoids that are running around, you can see that there's atrophy of the neuronal tree networks in both of these systems. So one of the only known triggers for building new brain cells, this doesn't mean that it's the only trigger, but it's the one that we have been able to study and show actually works, is vigorous aerobic exercise. So when I was in school, I learned, I know monstrously like a long time ago, I learned that you didn't have neuroplasticity in the brain past about the age of 5. So you had kind of all the neurons that you were going to have, and it was all kind of downhill from there. You were just going to lose your brain cells over time until, like, you get really old and are feeble-minded. That was kind of the thought when I was in college, right? And so since that time, we've actually found out quite a lot that there is a lot of plasticity that also can occur within the brain. Right? So in other places inside your body, you have a lot of turnover of the cells and generation of new cells. For example, like your blood cells, your red blood cells, they turn over in about every 2 weeks. You have to remake all of your blood cells inside your body. The cells that line your intestines, you will slough off cells that can make the size of a bowling ball during the year of your intestinal cells. And those just get removed from your body as you eat and eliminate waste from your body. Some of those dead cells that come off of there just go out with the rest of everything else, right? So, but in the brain, this doesn't happen as fast, but it does also happen. So the brain can have growth, and new neurons can be born and generated, and you have cell division, and you can generate new cells inside the brain throughout your lifetime. And one of the major triggers that we've found for this is vigorous aerobic exercise. So another key reason why exercise is important. It helps to keep your brain healthy as well as your muscles and your cardiovascular system. So exercise, important for brain plasticity. Exercise has also been shown to increase endorphins inside the brain. These endorphins are your body's natural pain relievers. So the opioids that you've heard about in the news, that Oxycontin and other fentanyl and all of those highly addictive substances, they will bind to the endorphin receptors that are inside the brain, and they can help alleviate pain and suffering. So there are some natural molecules that your brain produces as well that are called endorphins that will bind to these receptors and block pain pathways. So when you exercise, especially vigorous aerobic exercise, it causes the release of these normal endorphins. And so you often will feel really good after you've exercised. You can feel like this runner's high, or exercise high because of the release of these endorphins and reduction in pain. So that's another factor that exercise can influence when we're thinking about the brain. So, with regards to stress, we still want to have a focus on reducing chronic stress. So, having some acute stress or a minimal amount of stress is going to be helpful. But if you have too much, then you get into a danger zone area where you can have bad things start happening that lead to more disease states. And this includes the shrinking of brain cells, which that's kind of crazy. But so your learning and memory ability can be inhibited if you have too much stress going on inside the body. So there have been studies done with a mouse model looking at the mouse's living conditions and the amount of stress that the animal has. And you can see that the mice that were used in this study have some different living conditions. They're given just the plain Jane cage here with nothing in it. Not very exciting for the mouse. They are given a running wheel in this setting. And in here, they're given a little home and some material that they can use to make bedding with. And they have a little hidey hole over here that they can crawl through this little tiny tunnel. And then in this one, this is like the deluxe apartment. You can also see that this home is bigger than the standard plain Jane cage. This home is the deluxe. They get both the little living home, they've got the bedding material, the little hidey tube, and they have the running wheel, right? So this one's kind of got everything. So in their study, they had an acclimatization period of 14 days. So the animals arrived, and then they kept them all in the same plain Jane cage for those 14 days. And then they placed them in their various homes that were to be their final destination, if you will. So some of them stayed in the plain Jane cage, and then others were distributed to these other deluxe apartments or the modest apartment with the running wheel. So they studied these mice in what was called the elevated plus maze, and did this throughout this study period to see the effects of stress reduction within the group. So what they saw is that exercise will reduce the stress hormones in the mice, right? So they call these homes the exercise home down here. They call this one the calming home because it's got places for the mouse to hide and make bedding from. And this one is the deluxe unit that is the calm home with the running wheel. So they've got the exercise present there too. So what they can see is on day 0, the amount of cortisol that gets measured, or stress hormones, right, is about the same in all of the mice, right? They're on day 0. They just get placed into their new homes, and they're all at about the same place. They look 14 days out after they've been placed in their different homes. So you can see the control up here, and the mice that live in the calm home with the house and the tunnel have a little bit of reduction in their stress hormones. The ones that have the running wheel but no home to hide in have a more dramatic decrease in the stress. So exercise is releasing some of their stress. Maybe they feel like they're able to run away from whatever might be scaring them. And you see the ones that have the calming home and the bedding and the tunnel and the exercise wheel have the biggest reduction in their stress hormones. And you can see that the longer they're in their homes, the more acclimatized they get to their home. And this reduction in cortisol is straight across for almost all of the living conditions, except for the control. That plain Jane cage is not a happy place for the mouse. They don't have any further reduction in cortisol levels. They're pretty stressed out. They have no place to hide. They have no exercise place where they can get rid of some of that cortisol. So some of the conclusions that we can make from this lecture is that exercise can reduce the stress hormones. It can cause the secretion of endorphins, right? So these are the pain modifiers. So you can reduce pain and increase your happiness or mood. So you can also reduce depression with the exercise. And this is at least as good as our common antidepressant medications can do. And in addition, you can cause the secretion of brain-derived neurotrophic factor, or BDNF, and this can increase neurogenesis and brain plasticity, which can be very important for increased learning and memory. And we didn't talk about some of the kind of cool studies that have been done in schools, but they have shown that exercise right before your toughest classes, such as in math or in science, can really help you learn that material better, right? So the release of BDNF occurs like very closely at the end of the exercise routine. So as you're exercising, you're releasing these endorphins, you're releasing BDNF, you're increasing your ability to learn and memorize new things. So that correlation with your classes and exercise can be really important. So I would suggest like trying to work in exercise into your routine right before your hardest classes. Maybe, half hour, an hour before you go into your math class, get your exercise or your workout in and see if that makes a difference for you, if it's easier to learn those hard subjects. All right, so next time we'll talk a little bit more about what types of exercise you should be doing and what the major recommendations are for exercise.